Welcome back to another episode of Rooftop Psychology, where we take your unconscious mind out of cruise control and throw your conscious mind into overdrive. Ego states. How many are there? What are they? Well, there's 3 ego states: parent, adult, and child. Now, when we talk about the parent ego state, we talk about basically the beliefs, the values, your fundamentals, and kind of how you live your life, right? What you grew up being told, what was right and wrong, good and evil, all these sorts of yin and yang topics of like, this is how you should live a life. This is how you should treat other people. That's your parent. The adult is basically the mediator, right? It's the mediator between your child and your emotion. It's the logic and rationality, right? It constantly battles between the two. Your child is basically just the emotional side of you, right? It can sometimes appear to be the irrational side of you. Envision yourself as that toddler on the floor, kicking and screaming and banging. That's the child ego state. Now, just because you're 30 years old doesn't mean you can't act in that same manner. So that carries forward with you for the rest of your life. The parent and the ego, these states all carry forward, they all transgress, and they all adapt to new things. So the set of feelings, thinking, and behavior that we copy from our parents, that's where we get the parent ego state. All right, so when you all of a sudden notice that, wow, I seem to be saying the same things that my parents used to say, or I act in a way that my parents used to act, that's where you get it from. Because we spend most of our time in that first few years of life, mostly through childhood in general, but definitely the first few years of life, 0 to 5, we really adapt from our parents or your forgivers, your whoever's kind of watching over you. Most of us, it's our parents, or at least people we call our parents. That's where we get that parent state ego from. The parent represents a massive collection of recordings to the brain, and these are all external events. All right, so these are all happening to us, right? And they all usually happen in the first 5 years of life. They are the two forms of parent that usually plays out is the nurturing parent and the controlling parent. Well, just by the nature of the 2 words, you can probably guess what each one of them means, but let's go ahead and define it real quick. The nurturing parent is the caring, the concerning, are you okay? Typically what we'd see or deem as the mother figure, right? The nurturer, usually, your masculine qualities are a little more rough around the edges, where your feminine qualities are definitely ones of the nurturer. All right, so that's where you get the nurturing, making sure that there's unconditional love, all those sorts of good things. The controlling parent, on the other hand, is the one that has the discipline, that really hardcore kind of structure. A lot of the times it comes across as negative because you hear the word no a lot, right? And it's really astonishing when you actually understand that the average child in those first 5 years of life hear the word no an average of 400 times a day. I'm going to repeat that because it's pretty astonishing to hear that. 400 times a day, the average child between the age of 0, birth, and 5 is 400 times a day. Wow. Are you one of those parents that had a 400-word vocabulary of no every single day? Me and my wife were really diligent about using something called the Socratic Method. And anybody who doesn't know what the Socratic Method is, it's a method by which you basically ask a question with a question. So if your kids ask you a question, why are there stars in the sky? Or why does the dog do that? Or where do babies come from? Lots of millions of different questions that a kid has. They basically go through this phase where they say why. And as a parent, you just, between everything going on, you seem to get frustrated very quickly with the concept that's so simple to you of, well, it just is. And the response is, just because. Well, it's really an inadequate response to a child. So me and my wife used the Socratic Method to answer a question with a question as many times as we could go about it so they could basically understand the question that they asked with the level of knowledge and experience that they had themselves. And that sufficed their answer every single time. Because the answer that I could give a 2-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old can be much more complex than what they could possibly understand. But if you ask them a question about why they think a particular way or what they think about a particular thing, they're going to give you their level of experience, education, wisdom, knowledge for that question. If they have another question based off of that, then again, you ask a question of, well, why do you think that? Well, this happens like this. Why do you think that? What do you think about this? And going down that rabbit hole of a question for a question with the Socratic Method really gives kids a sense of fulfillment that their question was actually answered, and it was better answered than you could ever answer because they actually answered it themselves to their level of understanding. So just a little piece of wisdom for any parents. It really does play a huge effect when your kids get to those teenage years, because you eventually get to the age with a kid in those teenage years where they almost get that same level of knowledge. And nowadays we have iPhones and Google and all the other search engines we possibly could imagine. The world of information is at our fingertips. And so it's very hard as a parent to always answer a question, articulate really well, with a great amount of wisdom and knowledge, because quite frankly, a 16-year-old kid can get a encyclopedia of knowledge at their fingertips now. So I won't go too much further into that. I'll stick on topic here, but that's the Socratic Method that me and my wife have done. We've achieved it very well. We're still going through it, and really it just kind of keeps you in that place of your kids coming back and asking you questions and keeping that door of communication open, because once your kids realize that they have nothing else to gain from you, that's when you see that sort of rebellious age of teenagers that comes out. This is generally why it happens. So those are the two parent ego states that we basically play off of, the nurturing parent as well as the controlling parent. Now, give you a bit of a scenario here on kind of what I mean. So, do you ever notice that all of a sudden a child starts parenting their younger sibling, right? Just because, again, we get to about 7, 8 years old, you're going to realize when you have two kids, or if you watch an older kid, they start taking up that parental role, quote unquote. And it's basically the learned behavior, right? They are turning around now, giving structure and discipline, telling what's right and what's wrong, giving belief systems to even younger children. So it's not a parent as in you have to be a parent. It's just simply the psychology of the ego state that comes with that, right? Both the parent and the child ego states, they're constantly being updated. It's a constant loop of new things, good and negative, right? So you can have something in your child ego state, for instance, that, could be very, very negative. Maybe you grew up in a household that was super, super strict. Maybe it was even to the point of unfair or abusive, which is highly unfortunate. A lot of those memories come back to, quote unquote, haunt you for the rest of your life. If something or a scenario, a person yells at you in a certain way, and that floods you back to your child ego state, you can start to clam up, you get quiet, you get reserved, and it may actually stop you from really being who you can potentially be in life, right? On the other side of that, the child ego state has lots of good memories. As we could all probably guess, we can all probably have the same sort of comparison. You can walk into an old person's house and you can be like, man, this house smells like an old person's house. And if you've smelt that smell, it's pretty much always the same. I don't know how that's possible, but it always seems to be exact same comparison of what you think is an old person's house smell, I also think is an old person's house smell. For whatever reason, that's how that works. Now, on the other side of that, we could also have the similarity that, well, every time I went over to grandma's house, she was always cooking. She was always making pies, or maybe she was a big baker. And that child ego state embeds in your mind. So every time you go and you walk into a bakery, that memory of child ego state floods back into you of being in grandma's house. And that's where our saying comes from, like, well, I want it to be like grandma's cooking, because that's such a positive feeling emotion to you, right? Remember, the child ego state is based on your emotion. All right, so we're going to move into the child side of it. That's our parent side. We got the two, the nurturing and the controlling parent, right? Now I've kind of given you an idea of what the child ego state emotion really is. Now there's basically three types of child egos we can fall that falls out in nature. We have the natural child, the little professor, coined, and the adaptive child. All right, so when you look at the natural child, it's basically that footloose, free, happy, kind of going nowhere, basically naive, not really aware of the consequences of what they're doing. They're just out there second by second, not really exploring to the degree, but just being there, right? They're just being there. You have the little professor, it's more of like the curious. Or think about the little professor as more like a study side of us, right? The study child, where you're exploring that sort of side of like Curious George, where you're starting to really become curious of how things sort of work. And you're maybe kind of looking at new things, right? You're being aware that there's other things out there, right? So you kind of put those two together of the natural child and the kind of the study child, the little professor sort of child, and you get kind of that free, wild child, right? You get the one that doesn't really care about consequences. Everything is new. It's fun. It's fantastic. Very naive. And then the curious one kind of gets you into trouble. All right. The last one is the adaptive child. Well, this is the one that they start to realize what's going on around them, and they either fit themselves into that mold or they start to rebel against it. And we all know as parents when the rebellious state comes out. All right. So the nurturing parent, obviously, side of us goes to the natural child, right? It's very loving, kind. It's easy. Whereas the controlling parent obviously combats the adaptive child, right? So that's the boundaries of beliefs and structure, the values, because they're fighting back against themselves, right? They're learning and they're not fitting in, so they're fighting back. Well, it's obvious that we have to have that balance there, right? Now, between that two, we have the adult ego state. And it's smack dab right between the two. So I want you to kind of envision on your shoulders. You know, we kind of always envision the devil and the angel on our shoulders in cartoons and stuff like that. I want you to envision on one side of your shoulder is the child ego state. On the other side is the parent. And these are constantly kind of battling back and forth. You know, sometimes the footloose and free fancy just wants to get out there, and the parent ego state goes, whoa, 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 there's way too much risk here. We need to calm down. We need to assess the risk. I don't want to get hurt. And the child goes, don't worry about it. Nothing will happen bad to us, right? Or you have hey, should we sneak in there after midnight? There's your child, right? The adaptive child. And the parent goes, no. We're going to get in trouble. We'll get called on. We're breaking the rules. All right, so those two battle each other. Now, in between there is you got your mind, okay? You got the two little ego states on your shoulders. And then imagine your mind is in between. That's the adult ego state. All right. It is constantly checking and balancing between both of them, right? And so it's trying to stop as much of the battling between the two as it possibly can. So the internal parent ego state may beat up the internal child saying, well, you're not very good at this. You don't look good in those clothes. You're getting overweight. You're too stupid to do what you're trying to do. And that's the internal parent beating up on the internal child, right? So they're fighting top of your shoulders, right? Or you may have the thing where a child may respond and says, well, I'm no good. I'm not very good at this. And the parent state says, no, you can do this. So you have this battle waging back and forth, right? If you're aware of the parent and child ego states, then you can actually understand the conversation you're having with somebody. So if you get into a confrontation, you're definitely in a battling of the parent and ego state. It's not a place you want to be with negotiation or good conversation. You want to be able to come to the table as two adult egos, not two just adults, because again, these ego states don't refer just to age. They refer to your mental mindset at the time. You want to come to the table with two adult ego states, rational, and solve a problem. Rationally have a conversation and make solutions out of it. If one of you comes to the table as a child, a temper tantrum, and envision you with your spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend, your significant other, and one of you comes and they're throwing a temper tantrum basically like they would as a 2-year-old on the floor, well, naturally the other person's going to combat that by being the parent ego state, and the fight begins, right? Because if you're throwing yourself on the floor like a 2-year-old and you're sitting there as 25 years old, well, your significant other is going to sit there and say, hey, this is out of control behavior. This is not how you conduct yourself. And now you get the parent, and then you feel the condescending and the judgment, and it takes 3 hours or maybe 3 days, or maybe if you're married like we have for me and my wife for a little while, you realize that sometimes it can last a couple of weeks, and it's really ridiculous over nothing. And that's because you came together as a child and a parent, and sometimes you switch the role right in between the middle of the fight. So then you're basically just two dang children fighting each other, and you need to come together as an adults. This is how you solve problems. So when you go out there and you want to be a leader from the state of the ego with the adult. Be an adult ego state, rationalize, contain your emotion. That's how you solve problems. So there you go. Hope that helps. We are always constantly living, updating, and changing to these ego states. Try and remain in control of your ego state so you can be the best you can possibly be and help others be the best they can possibly be. Hope you enjoyed that episode. I will see you on the next one.